I'm going to continue a little bit more from the bunker perspective on efficiency, continuing on from the DNV GL presentation, keeping it at a higher level rather than diving down. When we look at next generation fuel management solutions, I'm going to take a little bit from my playbook from DNV when I used to work for DNV. So that's using a risk-based approach. And risk, you look at the probability of an event that's not looked out for, and its consequence and any impact that it may have. An overview of what I'm going to cover is the fuel quality via fuel specifications. Just some highlights, not necessarily to overview onto the next session. We'll look briefly at the component maintenance and any system upsets where you could take those as you identify the risks in your fuel system. We'll look at some of the drivers. Those were previously covered in the session before. We'll look at regulatory drivers, the fuel price. I'm not going to dive too much deeply into that, and also the efficiency drivers that everyone has been talking about. And then finally, the solutions, again at a high level. You want to make sure that your solutions are cost effective. As the previous presenter said, you want to make sure that your return on investment is sound. And last but not least, that it's sustainable. Excuse me. Looking at fuel quality via fuel specifications, there's the most common one is ISO 8217. Speaking to some laboratories, testing laboratories, if you take the 80-20 rule, it's probably 20% of the operators have adopted the 2012. Why? Because they want to protect, make sure that they got what they paid for. Typically, the 2012 pricing is slightly higher because there's more parameters that must be met by the fuel supplier. In order to meet some of these new parameters, the refiner or blender supplier has to add some investment, whether it's in the form of additives or other type of blending magic that they do to make sure that the 2012 spec is met. But 80% of operators and those that test their fuel against a fuel spec still predominantly use the 2005 because it's what they're accustomed to. Plus it's slightly cheaper. So the notable changes, as you all well know, are the sulfur limitations are now deferred to as statutory requirements. They're no longer listed in the 2012 spec. The aluminum and silicon limitations have been lowered, and the lower viscosity grades have even lower spec for aluminum silicon. Why? Because there's more cutter stock that's in those lower viscosity grades, and you have a higher likelihood of having aluminum and silicon particles. Therefore, to protect the buyer, and the limits have been lowered accordingly. Used lube oil limitations have been combined. Before they used to be individual parameters that had limits. Now they've been combined to reflect more on how lube oil additive manufacturers combine their additive packages. The used lube oil that's spent is recycled into marine fuel oil. You could have up to 1.5% recycled lube oil in residual fuel and have it still meet the spec. Whether or not that causes a problem, we'll go into that in the next few slides. Last but not least, the DMC distillate grade, which is your dirty diesel oil or MDO, that has a little bit of residual fuel in it from either blending or transferring through the pipeline, has been transferred as a new residual grade called RMA10. The new parameters that were introduced in the 2010-2012 are acid number. Again, this is to protect the operator and the bunker buyer. H2S, CCAI, which is an indication of your ignition quality, and oxidation stability. Some fuels you don't use all the time, so you want to make sure that that fuel remains stable while it's in storage when you're not in an ECA, for example. And last but not least, lubricity, which is of utmost importance as of this past January. So I'm not going to dwell any more on that. The next session will probably cover more of these parameters. Component maintenance, what I'm talking about here is when you look at your, holistically at your fuel system, you're looking at your storage system where you bunker your fuel and store it, your service system where you prepare it for use in your combustion, your engine itself. Again, holistically, I'm trying to cover everything, next generation fuel management solutions. And last but not least, in your exhaust system, that includes exhaust valves and your economizer. Most of the time when you have to take action on any of these components in the system for maintenance, You base it on time based on the engine manufacturer, component manufacturer, some set limit. But as we all well know, that condition monitoring practices have come into force. So most folks like to be proactive in their maintenance programs. That's fantastic. The time-based ones have been more or less planned maintenance. But as we all well know, reactive maintenance is maybe what some of you are spending most of your time for. So if you're not managing these components either through proactive maintenance or planned maintenance, you spend a lot more time and money flying parts all over the world, and that's reactive maintenance, and we don't want to be in that scenario. When you look at identifying the types of risk you have in the system, we'll start off in the storage system and go on through all the way up to the engine. So you could have stratification of fuel where if the fuel was not blended properly, that still happens, and as a result you'll have sludge formation possibly. You have water contamination from the humid marine environment that condenses on tank walls and collects at the bottom of the tank. You could have cat fines build up from some of these low sulfur fuels that you have on board, and also some residual fuels that have a high percentage, especially low viscosity fuel oil grades. You could have any type of contamination that includes the acid, biofuel. In some geographies you have a lot excess capacity of biofuel or bio components production, so that ends up in the marine fuel space as well. And I mentioned earlier the used lube oil contamination. From the water, you have the microbial growth that occurs, and the microbial growth, you have some sulfate-reducing bacteria that produces more H2S, which is a hazard to your crew. You could have, from the sludging, you could have overloaded centrifuges. You could have tank corrosion that could occur from this iron-eating bacteria that could corrode the surfaces of your tank. Fuel switchover, when you go from high sulfur to low sulfur fuel, you could have some problems with sludging there as well. And from that sludging, you could have filter choking, any combination. So all of these, if you look at them holistically, we're not just looking at efficiencies, now we're looking at the entire system, using some of the same elements for mitigating some of these risks, and to maybe possibly solving some of these other risks that you've identified. These risks that you've identified may not necessarily be requiring mitigation, but based on your level of risk tolerance, if you want to invest in mitigating a particular risk, you could look into the solution itself. Moving on into the engine, you look at how you pressurize the fuel. You could have the incorrect viscosity that could result in fuel pumps leaking. You could have insufficient lubricity that could result in seizing of your injection equipment. When you go into the fuel valves themselves, you could have internal deposits that could come from some of the contaminants I mentioned in the previous slide, and you could have the traditional carbon deposits that form at the tip. In the combustion chamber itself, you could have high temperature corrosive wear from contaminants in the fuel. That's typically vanadium, sodium. Low temperature corrosive wear, which has been highlighted with some new test kits that are available now in the market. The catalyst finds abrasive wear. Again, I mentioned the low sulfur fuels and the RMA10 as a possibility, and I'll mention in the regulations how that's going to be more of an impact in the future. And obviously in 2020, when the whole world goes to 0.5% in deep sea shipping, that may be a factor as well. And the traditional carbonaceous deposits on the crown, and the liner, and more on the cylinder load balancing, that also has an impact in your efficiency overall. When you look at your risk assessment and where the consequences are, I've taken some examples on the risk identification, and I've listed the consequence, and also how it impacts you operationally and your profits. So budgetary impact, and again, touching upon what was presented by DNVGL, I'm not going to go over into each individual one. And when you look at the drivers themselves, why do you need next generation fuel management solutions? We'll take a look at historically what has happened when you had the 0.1% limit that was enforced until December of last year. Typically, fuel suppliers, blenders, and refineries blend them to meet a sulfur limit. What they do is they blend the slurry oil that is coming from the cat cracker that has cat fines in it, and they blend it with high viscosity residual. They used to blend it to meet a viscosity requirement, but now it's more for a sulfur requirement for the 1%. what happened in January is predominantly everyone has switched to distillate fuels. Most distillate fuel oil grades meet the spec. Some of them are slightly above. So you have to specify a 0.1% low sulfur marine gas oil. Other alternative fuels, again, the next session will probably cover this more. The RMA10 residual fuel is also available. Biodiesel, you've heard from the previous session, you've heard about alternative fuels like LNG. You also have hybrid fuels. Hybrid fuels is a special category that are neither distillate or residual. There's some controversy whether it actually meets certain requirements, let's say in the EU, that will it distill correctly? Is it a proper low sulfur fuel or not? But that remains to be seen as more fuels are tested and availability comes more into play. What hasn't been mentioned in the regulations from the earlier presenters is what's happening this July. In Hong Kong, you have a requirement because for the last few years, Hong Kong has been toying around whether the availability of low sulfur fuel of 0.5% is actually available, and it is. So what they've decided is this July, you'll have a requirement to have 0.5% when you enter the port of Hong Kong. What does that do? Its neighbors are also vying for a 0.5%. So just north of Hong Kong is Shenzhen, manufacturing center, a lot of container ships. They're also vying for 0.5%. What eventually will happen is it'll become an ECA in the Pearl River Delta. And if that comes to fruition in 2018, as they wish, probably Shanghai to the north will probably do the same exact thing. So low sulfur fuel oil is going to be here to stay. It's not necessarily 0.1, but 0.5 will be with us, as well as in 2020 when the rest of the shipping lanes require low sulfur fuel. Fuel price, I'm not going to dwell on this because a lot of presenters have already commented on it, but what I will comment on is maybe a different take. As the prices in crude oil dropped, residual fuel have also dropped in price. But what hasn't happened, okay, distillate fuel prices have remained elevated. We've already seen that the switch from distillate fuel to from residual fuel, earlier in the year it was high, but now it's averaged about 80%. When you look at the next generation efficiency fuel management solutions, all you're trying to do is convert the fuel energy into useful mechanical energy, and what you want to do is to try to mitigate some of these issues that I mentioned earlier. So these are all listed here. Last but not least is engine condition monitoring. You could have components that are already embedded in the main engine, but you may need third-party engine monitoring. And the last slide, you want to make sure that your solution has a cost-effective treat rate, that bang for your euro, for example, return on investment. Make sure that it benefits you in your market competitiveness and that they're sustainable. Thank you.